You're listening to a Nite Muse media production. Tonight we return to the lost art of radio storytelling. Close your eyes if you like, and let the theater of the mind begin. Your host, John Robinson.
Some stories begin with adventure, some begin with mystery, and some begin with a young man who needed money badly enough to agree to a job he should have asked more questions about. His name was Bobby. Now, Bobby was a good kid. He was honest and hardworking, fresh out of high school and trying to save enough money to head off to college by the end of the summer. He didn't need much, just enough to make the start of his new life possible. Tuition was one thing, books were another, and then there were all the little expenses people always forget to mention until they hit you like a ton of bricks. So Bobby was looking for work, basically any kind of work. He was telling everybody he needed a job, neighbors, friends, cashier at the hardware store, the dog down the street. And finally one afternoon, while he was talking over the fence with a neighbor who worked at the zoo, the man tilted his head and said, "Well, now we may have something for you." And Bobby's ears perked right up. The neighbor leaned in a little and lowered his voice in that way that people do, when they're about to offer you a questionable opportunity. "We've got a situation," he said. "We need a little help for a couple of days. It's temporary, but if it goes well, there could be full-time work in it." Well, that was music to Bobby's ears. "A zoo job," he said. "Yeah, I can do that." The man said, "Well, just be here in the morning then." That night, Bobby could barely sleep. He imagined feeding elephants or helping with the monkeys, maybe driving one of those little zoo carts around, with the serious look of a guy entrusted with exotic responsibilities. He arrived the next morning bright and early, ready for real work. The neighbor met him near the service entrance and said, "All right, here's the situation." Already Bobby noticed something in the guy's tone. Not regret, but more like the tone a person uses when they know the next sentence is going to sound worse out loud than it did in their own head. The guy said, "Our gorilla has come down with a touch of the flu." "A gorilla can get the flu?" Bobby asked. "Well, yeah. Well, let me tell you, they're not pleasant patients." And then he pointed to the gorilla house. "He's being kept out of public view to rest up, but people come from all over to see him. And if they don't see a gorilla, they'll want refunds. And if they want refunds, management gets cranky. And when management gets cranky, everybody suffers, blah, blah, blah." Bobby slowly acknowledged the situation. Then the man opened a storage room door. Inside, hanging from a hook, was a gorilla suit. Dark and hairy. The guy said, "I'd like you to wear this and sit in the gorilla enclosure." The man had a grin of somebody who has already convinced himself this is perfectly reasonable. Nobody's going to know the difference. Now, at this point, a wiser person might have said, "I appreciate the offer, but nah." A wiser person might have asked about safety. A wiser person might have wondered why the zoo had a gorilla suit ready to go, which suggests this was not the first time they had solved a staffing issue with deception. But Bobby was young and needed the money, so about 10 minutes later he was climbing into a gorilla costume that smelled faintly like mothball sweat and poor decisions. At first it wasn't so bad. He sat in the enclosure, he scratched his shoulders, shifted around, glanced around. Visitors came by and gasped, "Oh, look, he's so real, take a picture." Man, Bobby started to think, well, this is easier than digging ditches. For the first hour or two, he simply did what he imagined a gorilla might do. He scratched his head, pounded his chest, yawned, stared at the kids, trying to look like he had great ape wisdom. And the crowd ate it up. The more they reacted, the more Bobby got into it. He began adding a little more touches. A dramatic chest pound here, a slow swagger there. In fact, one of his thoughtful poses made a woman say, "He looks like he's reflecting on something." So by lunchtime, Bobby had become, in his own mind, less a substitute zoo worker and more a performer. I guess you could say he thought he was a star. And then he saw the vine. It hung there in the enclosure as part of the habitat setup. He looked at it, the crowd looked at him, and then he thought, well, this could be how I secure full-time employment. He grabbed the vine and gave it a gentle swing. The crowd started cheering, so he swung a little higher, and more cheering. Now the kids were laughing, cameras were going, adults were calling to each other, "Come here, this girl is incredible." Bobby got intoxicated by all the applause and attention, and started to swing even higher. And that was the moment the job began to leave the rails. His grip slipped, the vine twisted, Bobby lurched sideways, let out a muffled yelp that no one could hear through the suit, and sailed clean out of the gorilla area and into the enclosure next door. He landed in a heap, the wind rushed out of him, his head spun, the crowd gasped, and for one strange second, Bobby thought perhaps this might still somehow work in his favor. Then he looked up and saw the lion. The lion was standing not far away, head low, shoulders rolling, eyes fixed directly on Bobby. Bobby wanted to remain calm, but he didn't. Every lesson he had ever learned about bravery left his body. The lion began to move towards him slowly and silently. Bobby scrambled backward across the dirt. He started trembling. He started breathing fast. And forgetting entirely that he was supposed to be a gorilla, he cried out in a frightened human voice, wait, I'm not what you think. But the lion kept coming. Bobby's mind went blank. He started pleading, don't eat me, I'm just a kid. I'm trying to save for college. But the lion kept coming closer anyway. The crowd was going absolutely crazy by now. They thought this was the most realistic zoo exhibit in recorded history. The lion came right up to Bobby's face. Bobby shut his eyes tight, certain that these were the last seconds of his life, and quite possibly the most embarrassing. Then from behind the lion's magnificent mane, a low voice whispered, quit your screaming or you'll get us both fired. And that is why you should never take a job at a zoo without asking 3 very important questions. Why do you already have a gorilla suit? Where is the actual gorilla? And is anybody else in this zoo also just trying to pay for college? Because if the answer is yes, you better not go to work at a zoo.